back through the book of Hebrews here. We're over in chapter 7. It feels like speeding to me, I don't know, but I'm pretty slow whenever we start to study the Bible. You guys might think it needs to be a little bit faster. But we're going to look at chapters 7 and 8 tonight. If you look on your handout, question number 1 at the top of your sheet is, what's something that you've replaced or gotten rid of recently? Anybody had to replace anything or get rid of something? A new motor? In what? In the what?
Leaf chopper.
Oh, in the leaf chopper. Okay. So I had to replace that. And why'd you have to replace it?
Well, it had a little hole in the block.
Oh. Doesn't work too good that way, does it? Yeah, so probably safe to say it was worn out then, right? Or at least torn up. Anybody else? What? You may not have anything specifically that you want to share, but generally speaking, why do we have to replace something or get rid of things? Yeah, generally speaking, I mean, when you replace something, it's because it's either worn out, it's torn up like your engine there, or it could be the case that, something better has come along, something more efficient that you can buy to replace it. And, technology, the days that we live in today, technology's outdated about as soon as it's updated, I think, but it seems like it's constantly changing. But, there are things that are better out there, and of course, if we choose to stay with some of the more older things, we're not going to be as efficient in doing what we can do. But generally speaking, when you replace something, do you get something worse than what you had before? No, you generally upgrade, don't you? You get something better. And the reason that I bring that up is because as we pointed out in our study of the book of Hebrews, that's really the theme of the book of Hebrews. Something better has come along. And since something better has come along, you get rid of the old and you replace it with something better, something that's improved, and something that's more efficient. And of course, the Hebrew writer, as he's writing about that idea, is talking about the law of Christ versus the law of Moses. Basically, we've had this theme throughout the book, how the law of Christ, or Jesus himself, is better than so many other things that were present under the law of Moses. And the reason that he's writing that is, as we've mentioned, these Hebrew Christians, of course, they'd obeyed the gospel, they'd been added to the Lord's church, but then they were trying to go back, turn away from the gospel and go back to the law of Moses. And basically what the Hebrew writer is saying here, does anybody have a problem with Paul writing the book in here? Is there anybody who disagrees with that? All right, I'm just going to start saying Paul then. If you disagree with it, you can talk to me later about it, and I'll say the Hebrew writer instead of Paul. But the reason that Paul is emphasizing that is because if they did that, they're basically giving up something better. They're giving up something superior, and they're going back to something that's inferior to what they had before. And so he's proving that point, again, through a comparison of New Testament things versus Old Testament things. A lot of it revolves around Jesus himself. So with that in mind, let's go over and start chapter 7 here. And I'm going to be optimistic tonight. I think we're going to make it through all this. So somebody read the first 10 verses for us here. Or if somebody wants to read the first 5, read the first 5, and then somebody else read the next 5.
This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returned from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abiding a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of his spoils. And verily they that were of the sons of Levi, who received the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is of the brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham, but he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed them that have the promises. Without all the contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, and of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. And as I may so say, Levi also, who received tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him.
Okay, so keep in mind the Hebrew writer is doing a comparison of the priesthoods. And it has to do with the priesthood under the law of Moses versus the priesthood under the law of Christ. And we read about this character last week. The Bible just briefly mentioned him, Melchizedek. And it goes into a little bit more detail about him here. But you know, he's one of those obscure figures in the Old Testament. And if Paul hadn't mentioned him again in the book of Hebrews, I don't think I'd even think about him twice when we read about him in the book of Genesis. Would everybody pretty well agree with that? I mean, there's nothing really in the account of Genesis about him that just, you know, you read about him, it blows you off the page and makes you wonder. But back in Genesis chapter 14, there's really only 3 verses that mention him. And if you remember the story of Lot and Abraham separating and Lot choosing to go towards Sodom, and remember there was a battle and all the people were captured, and of course Lot was captured in them, and Abraham set out with his servants to recapture Lot. And so they defeat all these kings who had conspired against this area, and they bring back the people and they bring back the goods. And as they're coming out in Genesis chapter 14, as they're coming back to Sodom in verse 18, it says, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God, Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all." That's the story of Melchizedek right there. And so what is the Hebrew writer, what is Paul doing here? He's referring back to this priesthood, this obscure man that we read about, who obviously was part of some priesthood during the days of Abraham. And his point that he's trying to make is there are greater priesthood than the Levitical priesthood. You know, there were greater priesthood than the priesthood under the law of Moses. And so, as you read about him here, let's go back to chapter 7. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through here. But in Hebrews chapter 7, question number 2 on your handout, what about the Genesis record? What about the life of Melchizedek that we just read about there foreshadowed the priesthood of Christ? What's the main comparison that's being made here about these two priesthood?
Remains a priest forever.
Yeah, so when you read about Melchizedek, now obviously it's not literally the case, but he's indicating to us from all the records that we have, which is 3 verses back here in Genesis 14, but from all indications that we know, Melchizedek was an eternal priest. And so there's no record of anything beyond that. And that's basically what the Hebrew writer is talking about here. Is there any record of his genealogy that we read about? I mean, who was his father?
Don't know.
Who was his mother?
Don't know, but he had.
Yeah. Well, who was priest before him?
Are you saying that he was not a human?
Melchizedek? I don't know. I think he was, yeah. There's some people who think it was the incarnate Christ, and that could be the case, but I don't see that. But yeah, I think he was. But as far as the record indicates, I mean, who was his mother? Who was his father? You know, when was he born? When did he die? You know, how do you go back and trace his genealogy? There was nothing that indicated, you know, the beginning and the end of his priesthood. There was nothing that indicated there was somebody before him or there was somebody after him. And that's really the point the Hebrew writer is making here. In that sense, his priesthood is just like the priesthood of Jesus. You know, there's when it comes to the capacity of the priesthood that Jesus is serving in, there's nobody before him. There's not going to be anybody after him. But there's no records of his roots, no record of his life, his birth, his death. And so he's making this argument. Now, remember, the whole point is that there are priesthoods that are superior to the Levitical priesthood. If you're going to go back and live under the Levitical priesthood, you're living under an inferior priesthood. There's better priesthoods than that. And so that's really the point that he's trying to make here. But how do we know? Did you have another comment or anything you wanted to add, Dennis?
Well, because there is a little in there, but there had to be quite a bit of teaching to the Jewish people about him or something. I mean, David, of course, used him on 119 or wherever it is. And so there had to be some teaching about him, and I would think for Paul or the Hebrew writer, whoever it is, to bring this out and to use it, they had to do some teaching, but yet there's nothing I could find nothing in any Jewish writings about it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing really to indicate that it was...
I couldn't find anything of a reference that I haven't got very many Jewish writings so in my library.
Don't have your whole library packed full.
But
yeah, and you know, it's amazing because, you know, a lot of times we read things in the Bible and we think, well, why is that there? You know, why is that person? Thousands of years, God anticipated, you know, he knew down the road somewhere he was going to have to try to show these people there's a greater priesthood than the Levitical priesthood. And so this guy is mentioned way back in the record of Abraham here as an example. And of course, again, just a sign of the foreknowledge of God. But he's an obscure figure. That's about all I can tell you about him. You know, people want to talk about him night and day, but I don't know anything about him. I mean, that's the record that we read about there. But the comparison that he makes there is this idea that his priesthood is forever, just like the priesthood of Christ. And so that's really the point that he's driving at. And then the secondary point, or maybe we could say this is the main point, his priesthood was superior to the Levitical priesthood. And of course, question number 3, this is where these questions tie in. How do we know that Melchizedek was great? Right? He mentions there in chapter 7 and verse 4, consider how great this man was. What indicates to us that Melchizedek was a great man?
Abraham paid tithes.
Okay, Abraham paid tithes to him. Who was Abraham?
Father of them all.
He was the father of the Israelites, right? And so Abraham paid tithes to this man, which indicates what? He was greater than Abraham, right? And so you have this idea, and not only that, but what did he do for Abraham? He blessed him. And how does a blessing work? Who blesses who in a blessing? Yeah, the upper person blesses the lower person, right? And so Melchizedek blessed Abraham, which indicates his greatness was above that of Abraham. And so, you know, that's why today, I mean, can we bless God? Why not? We're the lesser. Can God bless us? Yeah, he's the greater. That's generally the way a blessing works. And so Melchizedek blessed him. And so it's again indication that the Hebrew writer goes on to describe the less is always blessed by the greater. And when you consider the Levitical priesthood, why did people pay the tribe of Levi tithes? Why did they do that?
To support the tribe of Levi and the priesthood.
Yeah, and where did they get that idea from?
Because they didn't get any inheritance from God.
Right. So did they just come up with this idea out of the goodness of their heart? Yeah, it was a commandment of God, right? And so men paid tithes to these people under the law of Moses because that's what God told them to do. Why did Abraham pay tithes to Melchizedek? There's no indication that it was a law. I mean, and that's kind of, I think, the point that the Hebrew writer is getting at. But it was because he recognized his greatness. It was because he acknowledged him as somebody greater than himself that Abraham paid tithes to this man. And so you have this idea, question number 4 here. How does Levi tie into all this? He's still unborn at this point, and of course he's the one who gets tithes under the law of Moses. But how does Levi pay tithes to Melchizedek? That statement was made in those verses we read.
Through his father.
Yeah, it was through Abraham. So where were Abraham's descendants at this time? Yeah, they were still in his body, weren't they? He didn't have Isaac yet. You know, we're still reading the early stages of the story of Abraham. So all of his descendants were still inside. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has Levi, great-grandson of Abraham. So the great-grandson of Abraham was still inside Abraham's body. And so the tribe of Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek, still being in the body of Abraham. And so you have this idea, again, the acknowledgement of a superior priesthood, acknowledgement of something greater than the priesthood that was to come under the law of Moses. So question number 5. Well, let's get somebody to read a few verses. Somebody read, let's go back to Hebrews 7, and somebody read 11 through 14 for us.
If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessary to a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood.
Okay, so question number 5 on your sheet here is, why did a new priest, a priest like the order of Melchizedek, come along to replace the tribe of Levi?
No need to follow it.
Yeah, look at verse 11 there. What could the Levitical priesthood not do? Yeah, I'm reading from the New King James Version here, but verse 11 says, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood. Is that what the King James Version says? Okay, so what could the Levitical priesthood not do? It couldn't make men perfect. And of course, when we're talking about perfect, what are we talking about? Yeah, sinless, right? Couldn't forgive men of their sins. Now, if the Levitical priesthood could do that, would we need another priesthood? No, that one would have been great. If forgiveness of sins could have been accomplished under that priesthood, there wouldn't have been a need for another. But because the Levitical priesthood could not perfect man, then that told us that we needed a better priesthood. You know, we needed a different one. And so there's a lot of verses, I think, coming up in the future that we're going to read a little bit about. But you think about, I'm going to read Hebrews 9:15 here real quickly. It says, for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant. He's talking about Jesus, of course, by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called might receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. When you think about, he's of course talking about the death of Jesus there, and when he died, he said he redeemed the transgressions that were under the first covenant. Well, what's the first covenant? It's the law of Moses, isn't it? When you think about men, and you think about the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifices that were offered of them under him, you think about the patriarchal age, could Adam and Eve and Abel, could they be saved by animal sacrifices? How did men receive redemption from their transgressions? under the law of Moses?
Same way we did.
Yeah, it was when Jesus died, wasn't it? And so you have this idea perfection could not come through the Levitical priesthood. These men didn't receive forgiveness by the blood of bulls and goats. They received forgiveness by the blood of Christ. He died for their transgressions, and when he died for their transgressions, they were forgiven of their sins. That didn't happen under the Levitical priesthood. It couldn't. And so you had this flaw with this priesthood. You know, what are we looking for? Perfection, completion, forgiveness of sins. Couldn't happen through the Levitical priesthood. And so that tells us that there was a need for a priesthood where that could be accomplished. So question number 6 here, if we're going to do away with the Levitical priesthood, what is a new priesthood? What's it going to require?
Change
A change in what?
law,
Law. Why is that the case?
because the old one wasn't perfect, the new one is.
All right, so the law of Moses made men from the tribe of Levi priests, right? That was the first covenant. Men couldn't achieve perfection through that. And so if the priesthood is going to change, the law is going to have to change, isn't it? You're going to have to allow priests from a different place, from a different area, in order for that perfection could be achieved. And so he's making the point here, question number 7, from what tribe did Jesus Christ come? Judah. So why is that significant? Yeah, could Jesus be a priest under the law of Moses? No. Only men from the tribe of Levi could be a priest. And so if Jesus was going to become a priest, the law had to change, didn't it? There had to be a change in the law. And the priesthood needed to be changed because he couldn't make men perfect. And so you have this argument that he's laying down, again, pointing out the inferiority of the priesthood that they're trying to go back under. So how is Jesus, we're not going to have time to read all this, but if you look through the rest of chapter 7, how is Jesus unique among the priests who represented the people before God? Look there in verses 23 through 25. How many priests were there under the Old Testament? A lot. Why? Yeah, because men died. Right? If you had a guy who lived forever, you'd have one priest. But because men died, there were many different people who became priests under the Old Testament. The uniqueness of the priesthood of Christ is it's permanent. You know, it's lasts forever because Christ is going to die. When we think about the priesthood of Christ, and I wish I had more time to go into the details of it, but the Hebrew writer says here, he could not be a priest on earth. Where is Jesus a priest today? I'll give you a clue. It's not on earth. That means in heaven, right? How long is he going to be a priest in heaven? Forever. It's never going to change. He's a permanent fixture. And so he couldn't be a priest unless that law changed, because he came from the law or the tribe of Judah. And so now he's become a priest because the law changed, and he's going to be a priest forever because he's not going to die like the men did under the law, living under the law of Moses. Question number 9 here. So what did the Levitical priests have to do before they offered sacrifice for the sins of the people?
One for themselves.
Yeah, the very first thing that every priest had to do every day under the law of Moses, they had to offer a sacrifice for their own sins. And notice that he emphasized that. Was that like once a week? How often?
Every time.
Every day. The very first thing they did every day was offer a sacrifice for their own sins. And then they were able to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people. Think about the greatness of Jesus' priesthood. First of all, did he have to offer a sacrifice for his own sins? No. These guys had to do it every day. But Jesus never has to do it. And the second part of the emphasis here is every day they were offering these sacrifices, but could they bring about perfection? No. So even though they were offering for their own sins and they were offering for the sins of the people, was complete and total forgiveness experienced of their sins? No. It wasn't until Jesus died on the cross that men were completely forgiven. They were forgiven in promise before that, but it wasn't until Christ died, his blood was shed, that sin was totally and completely forgiven. How many times, they were doing this every day, how many times did Jesus have to sacrifice? Just one sacrifice and he's done. And so you can see the argument that he's making here, how you're going back to an inferior system. The men themselves were flawed. They had to offer sacrifice for their own sins. And then they had to do it every day for the sins of the people. And they still couldn't make people perfect. Jesus just did it one time, and now sin's completely and totally forgiven. So you can kind of understand. In chapter 8, we get into the idea, of course, of the better covenant. And question 10, we've talked about the job description of a high priest. I think we mentioned that last week a little bit. But in verse 1, it says, now this is the sum. The King James Version says the sum of the things that are being said. What's that mean? What's the word sum mean? Yeah, it's the main point, right? So this is what it all boils down to, is what he's talking about here in this chapter. It has to do with the high priest that we have. And when you think about the job of the high priest, of course, we read about in the law of Moses, we talked about last week, his job was to help the people offer gifts and sacrifices. But basically, I'm just going to summarize it in this way. The job of the priest under the law of Moses was to serve or minister to the people. Their job was to help them, offer gifts to God, offer sacrifices for their sins. When you think about Jesus today, and what is Jesus doing in heaven? Well, we know he's not making a continual sacrifice. He only had to do that one time. Is he interceding for us today? Yeah, he's still serving the people, isn't he? Just like the high priest did under the law of Moses. He's still intervening and helping the people. So, it's not just the case that Jesus is up there in heaven sitting around doing nothing, right? He's working as a priest. And you read about this idea, the Levitical priesthood, question 11 here. It says they were just a copy, or they were a shadow, or a pattern. What do all those words indicate?
A lesser version.
Okay, so if I told you I have a copy of the Declaration of Independence.
I want to see the original.
Okay, why?
Because it could be something that it wouldn't be as great as the original.
Yeah. When we look at the religion of the Old Testament, the law of Moses, the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood, it was a copy of the real thing. That's what God told Moses. He said, see that you make everything according to the copy. We say pattern, but that's the idea. It was a picture of what was happening in heaven. And so he gave this system to them, and this idea of a high priest to help develop this working idea of what Jesus is doing for us today. And so it's an example of the real world, or the heavenly world, as he talks about here. The law of Moses kind of gives us a rough idea, an outline or a sketch of what's happening in heaven today and what Jesus is doing there as a high priest. Then he talks about the superiority of the new covenant to the old. What ways, question 12 here, in what ways is the new covenant superior to the old? Yeah, I just said, what way isn't it? Everything, right? He talks about the service, the ministry under it. He talks about the promises. The promises in the law of Moses, they were good promises, but they were physical. They were temporal. The promises in the new covenant are eternal. They're spiritual. So in every way, the mediator, the person who stood between God and man and brought God and man together. In the Old Testament, it was a great man. It was Moses, wasn't it? But today it's Jesus Christ, and that's an improvement. That's an upgrade. And so in every way, the new covenant is superior to the old one. Mainly, though, the point that he makes here, how does God respond to sin under the new covenant? What's the difference between his response under the old covenant versus the new?
He will not remember
Yeah, when you get over to chapter 10 and verse 3, it says, in every year there was a remembrance of sin. You know, did God completely and totally forget about men's sin? No. There was a memory. Every year it was brought up. The Day of Atonement happened. It was rolled forward another year. What were they waiting for? The death of Christ, right? Because then God said, I'm not going to remember it anymore. I'm going to be merciful. I'm going to forgive your sins. I'm going to be merciful to your unrighteousness. And so the great difference between the two is complete and total forgiveness of sin. What the priesthood of Christ was able to accomplish is perfection under the new covenant. The Old Testament, the Levitical priesthood could not accomplish that. So that's kind of a nutshell there, chapter 8 and chapter 7. Anybody got any thoughts or comments or questions? We'll talk about this a little bit more next week. Have some more stuff along those lines. So.